It began the way most catastrophes begin in America. Quietly, without warning, without witnesses who lived long enough to describe what they had seen. A farmhouse in eastern Kansas burned to its foundation in the middle of the night, and when the local fire department arrived at sunrise, they did not find bodies. They did not find bones. They found a black circle scorched into the earth, perfectly round, perfectly silent, as if something enormous had pressed itself against the world and lifted away again. The family that had lived there for 3 generations was simply gone. No footprints leading into the cornfields. No tire tracks leading away. Only that ring of ash still warm beneath the morning dew. 3 days later, a second farm vanished. Then a fourth. Then a seventh. By the end of the week, 6 counties had reported missing families, and the only thing connecting them was a strange marking found on the few walls left standing. A symbol no historian could identify. 2 curved lines crossing inward, like wings folding around a wound. Investigators photographed it. Forensic teams traced it. Cult specialists were quietly flown in from Quantico. None of them could explain why the symbol was always burned from the inside out, as though the heat had come from within the wood itself. In Manhattan, on the 70th floor of Vought International, the reports landed on a polished mahogany desk. Executives skimmed them between morning coffees. A rogue soup, they decided. Some unregistered teenager with anger issues and a heat vision problem. It happened occasionally. A scandal to be managed. A liability to be buried. They drafted press statements before they finished reading the files. They allocated cleanup budgets before they understood what they were cleaning up. The machine moved as it always moved, smooth and self-satisfied, certain that nothing in the world existed which it had not already weaponized, marketed, or destroyed. Then the surveillance footage arrived. It came from a gas station in rural Missouri, a camera mounted above a rusted pump, the kind of forgotten lens nobody ever expects to capture anything. The timestamp read 3:17 in the morning. The image was grainy, washed in the sour yellow of a single sodium light. For 9 seconds nothing moved. Then at the edge of the frame, high above the tree line, something hovered. A small shape. A child. Arms loose at his sides. Feet pointing downward toward the earth as though gravity itself had asked his permission and been denied. He did not fly the way Supes flew. There was no posture of triumph, no outstretched fist, no cape catching the wind. He simply hung there, watching the world below with the patient stillness of a thing deciding what to do with it. In the Vought boardroom, the footage played on a loop. Executives leaned forward. Marketing teams whispered. Someone said the word potential, and the word hung in the air like smoke. Homelander stood at the back of the room, arms folded, eyes fixed on the small floating figure. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was softer than anyone expected. He said, "That is not one of ours." And the room went quiet, because everyone understood that he had not meant it as a question. The executives did not understand what they were looking at. They saw a product. A younger face for an aging brand. They saw revenue projections and merchandise lines and the slow, golden rise of a new American myth. They did not see the way the child tilted his head in the footage, the way his eyes seemed to reflect more light than the camera could account for. They did not see the absence behind those eyes, the patience, the quiet arithmetic of a mind measuring the world for weakness. Because this was not another Supes. There was no compound V in his blood. No contract in his name. No handler standing off stage with a clipboard and a smile. He had not been manufactured in a lab or marketed into existence. He had fallen from somewhere else, somewhere older and colder than corporate ambition, and he had landed in a country that believed itself immune to gods it had not invented. He was watching. He was waiting. And worst of all, he was learning. Inside Vought Tower, the mood shifted from concern to appetite within a single afternoon. The footage of the floating child was scrubbed, enhanced, color-corrected, and run through every analysis program the company owned. Engineers measured his altitude. Statisticians estimated his age. Stylists, summoned from the marketing floor before they fully understood why, debated the shade of his hair and the symmetry of his face. By sundown, the boy had a code name, a projected demographic, and 3 competing logo concepts pinned to a corkboard in a windowless room. Stan Edgar watched it all from behind his glasses, saying little. He understood, as he always understood, that the company had not yet decided whether this child was a threat or a treasure. The distinction in his experience was rarely meaningful. Threats could be sold. Treasures could be weaponized. The only real question was who would write the story first, and Vought had been writing the story of American power for longer than most countries had been alive. The executives wanted a new god. That was the truth beneath the meetings, beneath the spreadsheets, beneath the polished language of brand expansion and audience capture. Homelander was aging, not in body perhaps, but in narrative. The public had grown tired of his smile. The focus groups whispered words like stale, predictable, exhausting. A younger symbol was needed, someone unspoiled, someone whose origin could be sculpted before the cameras arrived. A blank page on which the company could write a brand new American scripture. Homelander listened to all of this from a chair he had not been invited to occupy. He did not speak during the presentation. He did not interrupt the projections. He simply watched the looped footage of the child again and again and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not jealousy. It was not anger. It was recognition. He saw in the small hovering figure the shape of his own childhood, the isolation, the slow dawning of superiority, the understanding, terrible and intoxicating, that the world below was made of glass. He had walked that road. He knew every stone of it, and he wanted very badly to meet the boy who was walking it now. The meeting was arranged with the careful theater Vought reserved for its most important encounters. A quiet farmhouse in the country, lawyers on standby, camera drones at a respectful distance. A table set with milk and cookies, because someone in branding had decided that milk and cookies would test well in the eventual documentary. Homelander arrived. He stood in the kitchen with his cape brushing the linoleum and waited for a child to descend from the sky. When Brandon arrived, he did not knock. He simply appeared on the porch, dust still clinging to his shoes, eyes unreadable behind a face that had not yet learned to perform. Homelander smiled the smile he had practiced for 30 years. He spoke of family, of brotherhood, of the loneliness of being more than human in a world of insects. He offered guidance. He offered understanding. He offered with the gentleness of a man offering poison the chance to belong. Brandon listened. He did not eat the cookies. He did not drink the milk. When Homelander finished his speech, the boy tilted his head in that small, terrible way the cameras had already captured once before, and he said only 4 words. "I do not need you." The temperature in the room dropped, not metaphorically. The windows fogged, the milk frosted in its glass. Homelander felt, for the first time in years, the cold edge of a presence that did not require his permission to exist. He laughed it off. He always laughed it off. But when the boy lifted into the sky and disappeared above the clouds, Homelander stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty porch. Vought wanted a new god. Homelander understood with sudden and unwelcome clarity that one had already arrived, and it had not come to be worshipped. It had come to inherit. In a damp basement beneath a butcher shop in Queens, Billy Butcher unrolled a map across a stained wooden table and began circling towns in red marker. Mother's Milk stood beside him, arms folded, eyes narrowing as each new circle joined the pattern. Frenchie smoked in the corner. Kimiko sharpened a blade against her thumb. Huey sat on an overturned crate with a laptop balanced on his knees, scrolling through police reports that the official channels had quietly buried. The room smelled of coffee and old blood, the way it always did when something was about to go badly for someone. Butcher had assumed at first that this was Vought's mess. It usually was. Some half-trained soup with too much compound V and too little supervision, blowing through cornfields like a tantrum with a heartbeat. He had seen it before. He had cleaned it up before. The pattern was familiar to him in the way old wounds are familiar, a dull throb that no longer required explanation. He prepared his usual tools. The contacts, the slow, methodical pressure that always cracked Vought eventually. But the pattern would not hold. The more Huey dug, the stranger the data became. The destroyed farm shared no demographic. The missing families had no political profile. There was no pattern of revenge, no pattern of recruitment, no pattern of corporate cleanup. Whatever was doing this did not seem to want anything Vought normally wanted. It did not want attention. It did not want fear. It did not even seem to want victims in any meaningful sense. It wanted, as far as the data could tell them, only to practice. Frenchie was the first to say it aloud. He set down his cigarette and looked at the map and said, "This is not a soup." The room went still. Mother's Milk asked him what he meant. Frenchie tapped one of the red circles. "No compound V in the soil samples," he said. "No genetic residue. No corporate file. No medical record. No school enrollment. No birth certificate. Whoever this is, he did not come from a lab. He did not come from Vought. He came from somewhere none of us have a map for." Butcher did not like that. Butcher liked enemies he could hate. He liked enemies with logos and lawyers and addresses. An enemy without a paper trail was an enemy without a throat to grab, and Butcher had spent his entire adult life learning to grab throats. He stared at the map for a long moment, then said the words none of them wanted to hear. Then it made itself. Huey felt his stomach turn. The horror of Vought, terrible as it was, had always carried with it a strange comfort. Vought was a system. Systems could be broken. Corruption could be exposed. Greed could be photographed and printed and burned into the public consciousness. But a child who had made himself, who had no creator to blame and no master to topple, was not a system. He was a fact, and facts could not be sued. They began to follow the trail more carefully. Survivors, when they could find them, spoke in fragments. A boy in a red blanket, a pair of eyes that glowed behind a barn door, a voice that did not sound like a child's voice even when it laughed. Kamiko interviewed one farmer through Frenchie's translation, an old man who had lost his grandson and his hearing on the same night. The farmer drew the symbol on a napkin with shaking hands, 2 curved lines folding inward. He said it had been carved into his grandson's chest before the boy was taken into the sky. Butcher stared at the napkin for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, the way a man pockets a piece of evidence he already knows will outlive him. The boys had spent years fighting monsters that wore American flags. Now they were facing something that wore nothing at all. No flag, no brand, no need for either. For the first time in his life, Billy Butcher was not certain he was the most dangerous man in the room. And the room, terrifyingly, was empty. Homelander found the boy a second time on a rooftop above a sleeping suburb in Illinois, where the streetlights ran in long amber rivers and the houses below breathed the slow, untroubled breath of people who believed they were safe. Brandon stood at the edge of the roof with his back to the wind, looking down at the town the way a child looks down at an ant farm, with mild interest and no particular plan. Homelander landed behind him without sound. The cape settled. The smile arrived a half-second late, as it always did when no one was watching to applaud it. He spoke first because he always spoke first. He told the boy that he understood. He told him that the world was full of small people with small fears, and that beings like them, beings touched by something more, were never meant to crawl among them. He told him about the loneliness, about the cages dressed up as homes, about the parents who pretended to love what they were really afraid of. He spoke in the soft, confessional tone he had perfected over decades, the tone that had once made a focus group of 50 mothers weep on command. He believed as he spoke that he was reaching the boy. He believed, as he always believed, that his voice was a key that could open any door. Brandon listened. He did not turn around. When Homelander finished, there was a silence so complete that the wind itself seemed embarrassed to fill it. Then the boy said, "You are afraid of them." Homelander's smile cracked at the corner. He laughed, the practiced laugh, the laugh that had carried him through 3 Senate hearings and a divorce that was never legally a marriage. He said, "No, son, I am not afraid of anything." Brandon turned at last. His eyes in the streetlight were not the eyes of a child. They were not even the eyes of a soup. They were the eyes of something that had been studying the species for a long time and had finally formed an opinion. "You perform for them," Brandon said. "You smile for them. You bleed when they boo. You are not above them. You are their pet." Homelander felt the words land in places he had spent his entire adult life sealing shut. He took a step forward and the boy did not flinch. He raised his voice and the boy did not blink. He told the boy that he could destroy him, that he could melt him into the rooftop, that he had killed gods younger than this and slept well afterward. Brandon listened to the threats the way a teacher listens to a tantrum, with patience that bordered on pity. When Homelander finally stopped, Brandon said, "Then do it." The world's strongest man stood on a suburban rooftop, eyes burning red, and did not do it. He could not say why. He told himself in the long flight home that it had been strategy, that it had been mercy, that it had been the cameras he could not see but assumed were watching. He told himself many things. None of them were the truth. The truth was that he had looked at the boy and seen the version of himself that had never learned to need anyone. A Homelander without the milk powder cravings, without the focus groups, without the desperate gnawing hunger for a single human face to look at him with love. The boy did not want love. The boy did not want fear either, not really, not the way Homelander wanted fear, which was only ever love misspelled. The boy wanted ownership. Complete, quiet, permanent. The kind of ownership a glacier has over a mountain, the kind that does not need to announce itself. For the first time in years, Homelander flew home in silence. He did not turn on the news. He did not check the ratings. He sat in his penthouse with the lights off and stared at his reflection in the dark window. And he saw, for one terrible moment, a smaller figure standing behind him in the glass. He turned. There was nothing there. But the impression remained, the way a bruise remains after the fist is gone. He had spent his whole life being the worst thing in the room. He had built an empire on that assumption. He had built a personality on it. And now, somewhere out there in the American night, a child with all of his power and none of his wounds was learning how to use the sky. Homelander poured himself a glass of milk. His hand, for the first time in his memory, was not entirely steady. Vought made the mistake every empire eventually makes. It tried to script the storm. The executives, panicked by the failed meeting and intoxicated by the footage, decided that the boy could still be salvaged into a brand. A press event was arranged in downtown Chicago. A crowd, a choreographed reveal. A new young hero, they would announce, discovered by Homelander himself, mentored by the company, the future of American strength. They printed banners. They hired a choir. They did not ask Brandon's permission because Vought had never in its entire history asked anyone's permission for anything. He arrived anyway, not from the wings, not from the chosen entrance. He arrived from above, descending through the clouds in a slow vertical line, and the crowd looked up and cheered before they understood what they were cheering for. The banner snapped in the wind. The choir began to sing. Homelander stood center stage with his arms wide, performing the role of mentor, smiling the smile he had rehearsed in the mirror that morning. Brandon hovered above the stage and looked down at the spectacle the way a surgeon looks at an infection. The first death was a cameraman. No one saw it happen. One moment he was filming. The next, his equipment clattered to the ground beside a small, neat pile of ash. The crowd did not understand. Some laughed nervously. Some clapped, assuming a stunt. Homelander's smile did not move, but his eyes did. He looked up. He saw the boy's expression. And he understood, in the way predators understand other predators, that the performance was over. What followed was not a fight in any language the world had learned to speak about fights. Brandon did not pose. He did not shout. He did not deliver a single line of dialogue. He simply began to disassemble the event. A row of Supes brought in as backup detonated like wet paper. The stage collapsed. The choir scattered. A wall of glass 30 stories high turned to glittering rain. The crowd's cheering became screaming so quickly that the audio engineers in their van were still adjusting the levels when the van itself was flung 2 blocks sideways. Homelander rose to meet him. They struck each other in the air above the city, and the sound of the first impact broke windows in 3 suburbs. Buildings leaned. A bridge swayed. A flock of pigeons evaporated in the heat between them. Homelander fought the way he had always fought, with theater, with monologue, with the certainty that every blow was being recorded for the highlight reel. He shouted at the boy. He called him son. He called him brother. He called him traitor. He hurled language as if language had ever worked on the wind. Brandon did not answer. He did not even seem to hear. He fought without ego, without pause, without the small, secret hesitations that come from a lifetime of needing to be loved. Every motion was clean. Every strike landed where Homelander had not yet thought to defend. The boy was not stronger, perhaps, in any measurable sense. He was simply unburdened. There was no audience inside him to please, no father inside him to disappoint, no God inside him to fear. He was, for those long minutes above the city, the purest expression of power the world had ever seen, because there was nothing else inside him competing for the room. The world watched. Live feeds carried it to every continent. Children watched it on phones their parents had told them to put away. Soldiers watched it in barracks. Presidents watched it in war rooms. And for the first time in a generation, the audience saw their strongest hero do something they had been told he could not do. They saw him bleed. They saw him stagger. They saw him, at one point, fall a full kilometer through the smoke and catch himself only at the last possible moment, gasping, his perfect hair stuck to his forehead with something darker than sweat. The fight ended without ending. Brandon did not finish him. He simply stopped, hovered, looked down at the broken city, as if remembering an errand elsewhere, and rose into the clouds. Homelander hung in the air for a long moment, chest heaving, blood on his teeth, and tried to compose his face before the cameras could find it again. He failed. The cameras found him anyway. They found the small, human flicker in his eyes, the flicker no Vought editor would be able to scrub out of the footage in time. By morning, the city skyline had 3 new gaps in it. The death toll would take a week to count. The injured would take a year to bury. And in every newsroom on Earth, the same single frame was being replayed in slow motion. The frame of Homelander's face, mid-fall, looking up at a child who had decided he was not worth finishing. The world had its new image. And the image was not of a hero. The cleanup began before the dust had settled, but the cleanup, this time, did not work. Vought deployed every instrument it had spent decades sharpening. The press releases, the paid analysts, the legal threats, the carefully grieving spokespeople in dark suits. They flooded the airwaves with the same words they had always used. Tragedy, resilience, healing. The words had worked for 30 years. They had buried scandals, dissolved investigations, rewritten massacres into accidents and accidents into miracles. This time, the words did not stick. They slid off the public the way water slides off scorched glass. Because the public had seen the footage, not edited footage, not Vought-approved footage. Raw footage captured on 1,000 phones, uploaded faster than any legal team could file takedown requests. They had seen Homelander fall. They had seen him hesitate. They had seen the small, unmistakable expression of a man who had finally met something he could not outshine. And once a god has been seen flinching, no press release in the world can paper over the crack. Stan Edgar held an emergency meeting in a room with no windows. He spoke quietly, as he always spoke quietly, and the executives around the table listened with the particular stillness of people who suspected they were about to be sacrificed. He told them that the company would survive. He told them that the brand had weathered worse. He told them that the boy was, in the end, only one more variable. The executives nodded. None of them believed him. They had seen the boy. They had seen the way he hovered. They had seen, more terribly, the way Homelander had looked up at him. And once you have seen that, you understand that variables do not hover. Variables do not choose. Across the country, governments began making calls they had not made in decades. Pentagon lines lit up. Foreign embassies cabled their capitals. Old contingency plans, written by men long since retired, were pulled from sealed drawers and read by trembling interns. The plans were useless. They had been drafted to contain Supes. They had been drafted to contain Homelander. They had not been drafted to contain a child who could not be bribed, could not be threatened, could not be photographed in a compromising position, and could not, as far as anyone could tell, be located on a map. Because Brandon was gone. Not dead, not captured, simply absent. The satellites lost him above the cloud line and never found him again. Search teams combed 3 states. Drones swept the Midwest in overlapping grids. Psychics, mediums, and a small army of self-appointed prophets were quietly consulted, then quietly paid to stop talking. He had become weather. He had become rumor. He had become the small, cold spot in every room that no one wanted to be the first to mention. The other Supes felt it before anyone else. They moved differently now. They flew lower. They spoke less. Maeve quietly applied for a passport under a name no one had ever heard or use. A train began a new training regimen and stopped showing up for press appearances. Black Noir, somewhere in his silence, was reportedly seen looking at the sky for long stretches without moving. The whole hierarchy of American superhumanity, the careful pyramid Vought had spent generations building, was beginning to tilt under the weight of a boy who had never asked for a place on it. And Homelander, alone in his penthouse, did the thing he had never allowed himself to do before. He turned off the news. He sat in the dark. He did not call anyone. He did not rehearse a speech. He looked out at the city he had once owned, the city that had once chanted his name in stadiums, and he understood, with a clarity he had spent his whole life avoiding, that he was no longer the apex predator of his own story. Something younger was, something colder was. He hated it. He hated it more than he had ever hated anything. And underneath the hatred, quieter than he would ever admit, he was afraid. The world tried, in the months that followed, to return to its old shape. The news cycles moved on, as news cycles always do. New scandals arrived. New wars threatened. New celebrities were manufactured and consumed. Vought rebuilt its stages. Homelander returned to his appearances, smiling the old smile, waving the old wave, and the crowd still cheered, though the cheering, if you listened carefully, was a half-second slower than it used to be. A small hesitation, a small remembering. The crowds had seen him fall, and even when they pretended they had not, their hands knew. But the reports kept coming, quietly, from places that did not usually make the news. A village in the Andes where every clock stopped on the same night. A fishing boat in the North Sea that radioed in about a red light hovering above the water, then never radioed again. A small town in Mongolia where 3 families vanished from their beds, and the only thing left behind was a symbol burned into the inside of a wooden door. 2 curved lines folding inward. The same symbol. Always the same symbol. Intelligence agencies traded the reports in sealed envelopes. They did not share them with the press. They did not share them with each other fully. They understood, in the way old institutions understand, that some fears are stabilizing only as long as they remain unnamed. So the world went on pretending. It went on shopping. It went on voting. It went on watching Homelander pose for the cameras with his old, bright, dying smile. And above the cloud line, somewhere none of the satellites could quite reach, something young and patient continued its slow study of the species below. Children sometimes looked up at the sky for no reason they could explain. They did not see anything. They almost never saw anything. But occasionally, on the clearest nights, a parent would notice their child standing very still at a bedroom window, staring upward, and would ask what they were looking at. And the child would not be able to answer. The child would only say that something had been looking back. The world still feared Homelander. The world would fear him for a long time. His face was on too many buildings, his voice in too many advertisements, his shadow in too many bedtime stories. But a new fear had entered the human bloodstream now, quieter than the old one and far more honest. A fear without a logo. A fear without a press release. A fear without a face the public could rehearse hating. It hovered. It watched. It waited. It did not need applause. It did not need approval. It did not need a country, a flag, a contract, or a name. It needed, in the end, only one thing, the same thing every predator eventually needs. And time, unlike Vought, unlike Homelander, unlike the fragile little empire of cheers and cameras below, was the one resource the thing above the clouds had in infinite supply.